Hello, everybody, and welcome to the channel. This is the world of the supernatural, and I'm Ursula Bielski, your intrepid host. And I'm so glad you're here with me today. I just want to talk to you a little bit about something interesting that I wanted to share as you finish your Christmas preparations coming up here at the end of December, just a few days before Christmas now. I just recorded an episode of The Ghost Lorist about a topic I love, which is the haunting of Charles Dickens. Dickens was, of course, immortalized in his ghost stories, especially A Christmas Carol. He wrote a lot of other ghost stories as well. And he was fascinated with the topic of the supernatural and the paranormal. He was reportedly one of the founding members of the Ghost Club, which was the skeptical society founded in London for the investigation into claims of the paranormal. And he did a little bit of ghost hunting himself as well. And he had some close encounters, we might call it. One in an Italian convent that he was staying at one time, where he saw this sort of Marian apparition in the room with him that spoke to him. And another time when he saw his deceased father and tried to actually put his hand on him, and then he vanished into thin air. This was also in the bedroom while he was sleeping. He had some interesting encounters, and there's a lot of ghost stories about Dickens today. They said that he haunts Rochester Castle, where he liked to take walks, and that's where he wanted to be buried. But famously, his wishes were ignored, and he's buried in, if you visit Westminster Abbey in London, you'll see his grave there in Poets' Corner among the other famous authors and poets that are buried at the Westminster Cathedral there. A lot of interesting paranormal stuff about Charles Dickens, but something that really a lot of things profoundly affected him, of course. He's a very emotional person. He felt things very deeply. His sister-in-law, who was very close to, when she passed away, he was so devastated he couldn't speak for 2 weeks. They were such close friends, and he wanted to throw himself in the grave with her. And a lot of people think, did they have something going on? But apparently, no, they just clicked, and they were just really good pals. But so he was just a very emotional person, and he witnessed there were two derailments in England during the last years of his life that really profoundly affected him. One of them led to the deaths of, I think, 33 people. And then the one that he was actually very closely involved with, he was on the train from Folkestone in the south of England to London. I think this was 5 years before his death. When the train derailed, there was a piece of track that had been taken out during construction, and they weren't aware of it. So the train derailed, and there were 10 passengers who died in this terrible accident. And it really clicked something in my mind, because we had a very similar accident here in the Chicago area in the late 19th century, where many of the people died in the same way on the train as did at the Staplehurst derailment, which was the one that right before Dickens's death that he was involved in. And he tried to aid the passengers, and passengers literally died right next to him or in his arms. So it was very close to him. And his son, after Dickens' death, said he never really recovered from experiencing that and living through it. But I wanted to share with you the story of the train derailment that happened here in the Chicago area, because, like I said, it really was a much of the same circumstances that were involved in the one that Dickens was a part of, because many of the people who died were scalded to death. And that's the same thing that happened here in Chicago. This happened in August of 1873, and it led to the deaths of 11 people and more than 30 who were just horrifically injured. And it was one of the most atrocious railroad wrecks in American history, though I never heard of the story until I started to work on my book, Haunts of the White City, which I'll put down in the link, and discovered this very old article in a railroad journal about the fact that many of the old railroad workers, or train engineers and train workers, had become very much afraid of going through making the stop for water in Lemont, Illinois. This is along Archer Road, southwest of Chicago. they really started to not want to stop for water there, which they always had to do because of how intensely haunted that stop area was, because that's where the train crash had happened that had led to all of these deaths. So let me tell you really quickly here what happened. The passenger train this was the Alton Chicago Railroad. So this was the train that was going from Chicago to Alton, Illinois, down out along the Mississippi River, across the river from St. Louis. The passenger train had left Chicago for St. Louis at its regular 9 p.m. departure time on August 17. On the run were a baggage car, an express passenger car, and 3 coaches, as well as 2 Pullman cars, the sleeper cars. At about 10:20 p.m., when the train was 3 miles north of Lemont, it came around a bend to discover a coal train coming north on the same track at about 20 miles per hour. If you're familiar with Archer Road and St. James Church at Sag Bridge, this is right near there. You can actually, if you just go to the end of Archer Road there to that 3-way intersection, you can actually see this bridge from that location. A dense fog had come over the Sag Bridge area, and the passenger train engineer had a rough time of it already. The fog and the bend combined with the actions of the coal train engineer, and it led to disaster. This is a quote from that article that I found. The 2 trains came together with fearful force. Being on the curve, however, both engines left the track and passed each other, that attached to the coal train, striking the baggage car a few feet from the end, breaking the coupling between it and the smoking car, which the engine struck square in the end, and with such force as to throw the forward end in the air so that the engine ran under it, tearing the floor completely out and hurling the 50 or 60 unfortunates who were in the car in a struggling mass to the lower end, where there was no chance for escape. And then ensued a scene of horrors which cannot be adequately described. The smokestack and dome of the engine were knocked off by the collision, and the broken timbers of the smoking car, penetrated the boiler of the train. So the boiler was ripped apart. So this let loose this volume of hot steam which poured into the car, and it blinded and scalded these helpless people in the car who were screaming and trying desperately to get out of the car. In the meantime, the conductor, a man named Russell, who was unhurt, and a number of the passengers from the rear coaches came forward and tried to assist these victims. But there was little left to do beyond taking from the wreck the dying and wounded, many of whom were fearfully scalded. The surviving passengers and crew, stunned at first by the scene, quickly went to work to aid the injured. One passenger observed the following. This is a quote from that article. In the meadows on either side of the track were lying human beings, yelling in agony, their flesh boiled off them. The freight engine had run clean underneath the smoking car, and there exploded, shattering the car into little pieces and blowing the occupants high up into the air and over the fence into the meadows. Absolutely horrible. The other engine burst at the same time. A man, I don't know who it was, ran up to me shrieking with agony and threw himself into my arms. I tried to hold him, but his clothes tore off of him and the flesh came off with them. I was nearly stunned at the sight. There were a dozen or more, stripped stark naked, running up and down, crazy. They were tearing at their bodies and tearing off great handsful of flesh. Just unimaginable horror. The surviving passengers, again, tried to tend to the victims. They were tearing off their own clothing, trying to bind up wounds, trying somehow to make these poor people comfortable. At dawn, the train arrived back in Chicago, pulling these mangled cars with the dead and the wounded on board. And it was determined that the cause of the accident was what was determined to be criminal recklessness. of the conductor and engineer of the coal train. His duty was to hang back the Lemont station until the evening passenger train had cleared. The conductor of the freight train was considered a solid driver with no strikes against him in the full year and a half that he'd operated for the line. After the accident, he panicked and fled Chicago. Like, he literally ran away and disappeared. The railroad company offered a $1,000 reward for his capture. A relative turned him in and split the money with him. No prosecution was ever started, and he went on to drive for years to come. Now, this is a little weird, interesting trivia. James O'Neill, engineer of the passenger train, had both of his legs broken in the crash, but he escaped with no blame for it whatsoever. But 5 years after the accident, the exonerated engineer O'Neill was shot by a man named Dwight Wheaton, yardmaster of the Chicago-Alton Railroad at Bloomington, Illinois, as O'Neill was walking home from the yard there one night. Apparently, Wheaton suspected O'Neill of having an affair with his wife. And after the murder, Mrs. Wheaton told the police outright that her husband had killed O'Neill, and that, moreover, her husband had told her to take his pistols and discharge them in a cemetery field in Bloomington. She also claimed that her husband had a wife out west. Curiouser and curiouser, as they say. In 1904, another deadly accident occurred at the same site where the 1873 tragedy had happened. A Chicago-Alton train had stopped for water at the old Sag Bridge water tower. The engine of the second train plowed through 12 coal cars and thrust an oil tanker into the air, causing a massive fire. These Sag Bridge collisions and the drama surrounding James O'Neill led to whisperings of a curse of Sag Bridge. Did you guys ever hear this before? Never heard of this before in 40 years until a couple years ago. The curse of Sag Bridge was accompanied by tales of hauntings at the site of the disasters. Now, long after the 1873 collision, Engine 122 returned to duty on the Chicago-Alton Railroad. This was the same engine on that train. The first night back in service, the train's cab lamps and headlights were mysteriously, quote, extinguished by some supernatural agency just as the train passed the eventful point of the accident. At first, the engineman thought but little of it except as a singular coincidence. But as time rolled along and the circumstance continued occurring at the same point upon all-night runs, it became evident that there must be some invisible agency that marked Engine 122 because of her connection to the great disaster. According to one report, the night watchman, I started to look for other ghost stories of Sag Bridge, and there were wonderful accounts of them in these railroad sources, magazines, articles. According to one report, the night watchman stationed at Sag Bridge resigned, saying that he could, quote, stand it no more. His superiors asked what he was referring to, and he said, the ghosts. He went on to state that every Saturday night when he went out to the watchman's shack near the bridge, he saw the ghosts of a couple that had been killed in the collision of 1873. It was soon common knowledge that along the railroad, that Sag Bridge was haunted. This was no small matter, as the site included this water tank that supplied most of the passing trains with water, as I mentioned. A water stop here was made for most of the trains that passed through that area, and as time went by, tales of these ghostly encounters during these water stops grew and began to accumulate. And legend says that another trainman actually ended up resigning. He was a freight conductor who was plagued, he said, with sightings of forms flitting to and from ahead of him and behind him as he clambered over the freight cars comprising his train. Engine 122's engineer would frequently see a man and woman climb on the pilot of the locomotive as the train neared Sag Bridge. Oh my God, I got chills. Jumping off the moving train when the engineer approached. So creepy. One night, two brakemen on a night trip saw what they called a ghostly-looking object seated on the steps of their train's caboose when they stopped for water at Sag Bridge. The figure fled the scene, and the men followed, watching as the ghost climbed a nearby farm fence and disappeared. Another brakeman talked of the ghosts of Sag Bridge, who were, quote, plenty. Often when walking by the train, examining the running gear, I could hear the chattering of teeth, the outcries of someone as if in anguish, till the chills would penetrate my very bones, end quote. He would go back to the train, glad to be back in the comfort and safety of the engine. And he would be there met with what he said were faces peering into the windows at me. The same man claimed to have shot at one of the figures, which was common behavior back in the day, to shoot at ghosts and throw things at them, which he said looked like a boiling mass of burning sulfur. He said that when he shot this thing, it, with a fiendish laugh, sank into the ground. So that, my friends, is the story of the story that I call the water stop. It's in my book, Haunts of the White City. Again, I'll put that link down below in the description of this video. But I thought it was really interesting that that accident that so affected Charles Dickens 5 years before his death, that he was actually involved in, was very similar to the circumstances at our own ghostly rail disaster here in the Chicago area. And it was interesting to find the story and put it right there with the other ghosts and hauntings of Archer Road, which we all know there are so many of those. Just I'm so glad that I was able to find that story and popularize it more so that it's carried on, because wow, talk about lost. Just there was who really knew that had even happened, except for a couple old timers who had worked on the railroads and knew all of those old stories. So it's only when I started to really dig for them and start to talk to them that I was able to flesh the story out and include it in the book. So I'm just so glad that it's like back out and like public knowledge. I'm going to put in the description to this video too a link to my Ghost Lores episode that is also coming out today, which is about the haunting of Charles Dickens. So that's a narrated kind of dramatic reading that you can listen to while you're falling asleep or working out or whatever. And I hope you sign up for that channel. It's a different channel than this, and I'm trying to build it up. So please, yeah, sign up for it. And there is a Patreon that you can join our community on that will help support me making those videos. So if you enjoy them, please consider joining our little Patreon community, which helps to support that work and everything that I do here at World of the Supernatural. And finally, I'm going to also put a link for a reading that I did on this channel last Christmas for you guys of Charles Dickens's very dark ghost story called The Signal Man. It was a very influential book for a lot of writers that would come after him, and it was directly influenced by the trauma of being involved in that accident, that railroad accident that we talked about. A couple things down in the description here, and I hope you check them out, and I hope you have a wonderful, very Merry Christmas. And as Tiny Tim said, God bless us, everyone. That means you. I'm Ursula Bielski. Until next time, remember to pray for ghosts. See you then.